Evil beyond evil is not so much a force of hate, but one of indifference. Hannah Arendt. You don't need to be a monster to do monstrous things. You just need to be at the wrong time and place. The Lucifer Effect is not only a fascinating concept, it is a window to the human psyche. Its name comes from the biblical figure of Lucifer, the fallen angel, the one who had everything and yet chose the path of darkness. But we are not here to talk about religion, but about psychology, about philosophy, about you. Think of the cruelest person you can imagine. A tyrant, a war criminal, someone who committed unimaginable acts against other human beings. Now think of someone kind, incapable of harm. What differentiates them? Is it your genetics, his upbringing, or simply the circumstances in which they were put? What if I told you that you could fall into this too? That evil is not an exclusive trait of monsters, but a latent possibility in all of us. In 1971, psychologist Philip Zimbardo attempted to answer one of the most disturbing questions about human nature. What makes us executioners? To do this, he designed an experiment that ended up revealing an uncomfortable truth about the fragility of our morals. An experiment that had to be canceled early because the line between simulation and reality completely blurred. Imagine this. A group of students are divided into two groups, prisoners and guards, in a simulated prison at Stanford University. None of them had a violent history or psychopathic tendencies. They were just normal young people, like you, like me, with a daily life, friends, aspirations. But the moment they were assigned to their roles, everything changed. Day 1. Students are divided into prisoners and guards. It all seems like a simple role play. The guards are given uniforms, sunglasses, and wooden clubs. Prisoners, on the other hand, are dressed in robes and assigned a number instead of their name. The atmosphere is tense but controlled. Day 2. The guards begin to take their role too seriously. Small orders turn into subtle abuses. What at first was a prison simulation now turns into a real power struggle. The prisoners begin to show signs of stress, and the guards become more aggressive. Day 3. Violence explodes. Punishments, humiliations, submission. The prisoners begin to break down emotionally. They are forced to perform strenuous physical exercises and are denied access to basic amenities. Desperation takes hold, and some begin to rebel, only to be punished even more severely. Day 4. The situation continues to escalate. The guards become increasingly sadistic in their methods, reveling in the power they have over the prisoners. Social and moral norms seem to fade within the walls of the makeshift prison. The prisoners find themselves trapped in a cycle of abuse and submission, with no hope of escape. Day 5. The psychological pressure is unbearable. Some prisoners go into states of emotional shock, while others show signs of mental disorder. The guards, blinded by power, ignore cries for help and continue their abusive behavior. The experiment becomes a true battlefield between morality and blind obedience. Day 6. The experiment gets out of control. Zimbardo, trapped in his own studio, realizes that he has created hell. Observe with horror how normal, ordinary people have been transformed into perpetrators and victims. Aware of the damage he is causing, he decides to end the experiment immediately. The experiment is canceled, but the question remains hanging in the air. Were they monsters? No. They were normal people, like you, like me. But the damage was already done. The guards, ordinary people, had become sadistic figures. The prisoners, also students like them, had been reduced to total hopelessness. And all this had happened in less than a week. The Lucifer Effect. That's what Zimbardo called what had happened. Proof that evil is not innate in people, but can flourish in anyone, if circumstances allow it. And this experiment is just a reflection of what we have seen in real history. At Abu Ghraib prison in Iraq, all hell broke loose inside a prison that should have been just a place of detention. American soldiers, charged with guarding the prisoners, began carrying out abuses so atrocious that they can only be compared to the worst accounts of torture: physical and psychological torture, public humiliation, inhuman treatment. Images of naked men subjected to cruel taunts and terrified prisoners, whose screams were lost in the air, were recorded forever. The most chilling thing about all this is that the soldiers who committed these acts were not psychopaths, nor monsters born of evil. They were ordinary people who one day were going home to their families, laughing with their friends, and suddenly they were put in an environment where their power had no limits, and their actions faced no immediate consequences. The most terrifying thing is that in the beginning, they were humans too. But in that context, abuse became a routine act. Who are we when no one is watching? And at the Nuremberg trials after World War II, humanity faced one of the most terrifying questions in history. Nazi officers responsible for atrocities that destroyed millions of lives defended themselves with a phrase that continues to resonate with chills to this day: "I was only following orders." But does that perhaps exonerate them from the irremediable? Were they monsters before the war started? Or were they shaped by a system that stripped them of their humanity, forcing them to do the unthinkable? They were not born with the desire to commit genocide. They were transformed, molded, dehumanized by a context that took away individual responsibility, leaving them to act under the mask of power. How much of that transformation could occur in any of us, given the wrong circumstances? And so, what can we learn from events like Abu Ghraib or the Nuremberg trials? History teaches us that, in extreme circumstances, even the most normal people can be driven to commit horrible acts. But what about us? Is it possible that, under the right conditions, we can also fall into the trap of dehumanization? Imagine that you are working in a company where everyone follows orders without question. One day, you're asked to manipulate the results of a project to make the boss look better. Everyone does it, and it seems like a small thing. Nobody questions. But you stop and think, what does that mean for your integrity? Are you willing to sacrifice your ethics just to fit in? Dehumanization is not something that only happens on battlefields or prisons. It is also present in the everyday decisions we make, in the small compromises we make, in the name of authority or comfort. So, I'm wondering, have you ever found yourself in a situation where you felt like what was being asked of you wasn't right, but you did it anyway? Have you ever felt safer or justified in your actions because you knew you wouldn't be identified? The reality is that we are surrounded by social forces that push us to conform, to do what is expected of us, without questioning the morality of our decisions. Social pressures, the expectations of others, the fear of losing our position or reputation. All of these play an important role in how we react when faced with ethical dilemmas. Now I'd like you to stop for a moment. Make a mental list of your principles, of those values, that you consider unbreakable. Reflect on a time when those principles were put to the test. What did you do at that time? Did you allow yourself to be influenced by external pressure? Or did you stand firm on what you believed was right? Don't underestimate the importance of questioning your decisions at every step. The next time you face a dilemma, whether at work, in personal life, or even in everyday interactions, ask yourself, am I acting in line with my values, or just going with the flow? I want to know from you, how would you react if you were asked to hurt someone? Even if it was something small, would you question it, or would you do it because someone else asked for it? Share your thoughts in the comments, and let's reflect together on how to find that balance between being true to our principles and acting in the world around us. And today, in the digital world, we can see a more subtle but equally destructive form of this phenomenon. The anonymity of the internet has made ordinary people, who in their daily lives would never insult a stranger on the street, become cruel attackers on social networks. They humiliate, threaten, dehumanize, because the screen gives them the same sensation as a uniform or a mask. The permission to act without assuming real responsibility. So what leads us to become executioners? First, unlimited power. When a person is given unfettered authority, without clear consequences, abuse becomes tempting. Not because they seek to do harm from the beginning, but because the feeling of control is addictive. It's like a slow poison. At first, it only feels like a small dose of power, but little by little it spreads until it begins to distort our decisions and our behavior. This is why abuses of power are so common in institutions where control becomes an end in itself, as in the case of the guards in Zimbardo's experiment. But you don't have to be a prison guard to understand it. At work, in family, in politics, there is always someone who can have access to a little more power. And that's when you have to ask yourself, how do I use this power? Am I helping, or am I subjugating others? Second, the loss of identity. When someone hides behind a uniform, a mask, or an ideology, their sense of individual responsibility fades. He no longer acts as an individual, but as part of a system. And when you don't feel responsible, it's easy to justify the damage. It's as if the mask, whether literal or figurative, strips you of your humanity. Have you ever thought about how your behavior would change if you didn't have to face up to your actions? If you could act anonymously, without anyone recognizing you or questioning what you do. This is why a soldier's uniform, the anonymity of social media, or even the ideologies of an organization can be so dangerous. Because by hiding behind something, your consciousness fades and the line between good and evil becomes blurred. Third, blind obedience. From a young age, we are taught to follow orders, to respect authority. And although this is necessary for coexistence, in extreme cases, it becomes a dangerous weapon. Because when orders go against morality, most people don't stop to question them. An example of this is seen in the soldiers at Abu Ghraib, who, although not psychopaths, carried out horrible acts under the premise of following orders. In their mind, it was not them who were torturing the prisoners, but a larger structure that dictated what they did. This brings us to an uncomfortable question. Do we really know when we are obeying for the greater good and when we are simply going along with the flow? So how do we prevent ourselves from falling into these traps? How can we prevent power from transforming us, ideology from dehumanizing us, or obedience from making us lose moral judgment? Awareness is the first step towards change. But how can we be aware of the evil that resides within us without falling into cynicism or hopelessness? It's about learning to recognize the small signs that arise when our behavior begins to misalign with our values. An example of this could be at work. If you are in charge of a team and you notice that you begin to feel superior to others, or that you overlook the needs of your team in favor of your own interests, it is time to reflect on your behavior. You may ask yourself, how does this impact others? It is important to take a step back and look at situations from an outside perspective. The next step is to question authority. This principle can be applied in many aspects of our daily lives. From education to work to politics, there are always hierarchical structures. However, authority is not an end in itself. Often, our blind obedience can lead us to do things we would never have imagined. Think about a situation in which you are asked to do something that you find uncomfortable or even immoral. Instead of continuing without questioning, ask yourself why that authority has so much power over you. Is what they are asking of you really aligned with the common good? A practical example could be at work when a boss asks you to do something that seems unethical to you. Instead of simply obeying, you can raise a conversation and discuss the possible negative impacts of that action. Finally, maintaining empathy is crucial. Empathy is the antidote to dehumanization. It is important to remember that people who seem to be on the other side are human beings like us, with their own struggles, emotions, and dreams. Practicing empathy can be as simple as asking genuine questions about the lives of others, actively listening, and trying to understand the other person's perspective. This is a daily practice that not only improves relationships, but can help us avoid the emotional disconnection that facilitates the abuse of power. Now tell me, are you sure you wouldn't do it? It is easy to think that, under our circumstances, we would never allow ourselves to be swept away by power, ideology, or blind obedience. But the truth is that most people, even those who consider themselves ethical, get swept along when circumstances change. History proves it time and time again. The most terrifying thing is that the victims are not always others. Evil doesn't just hurt others, it also consumes you. It dehumanizes you. And by the time you realize what you've done, it may already be too late. But the good news is that there is a way around it. Recognize the signs, question authority, and keep empathy alive. Evil is not a distant entity. It is not a monster hidden in the dark. It is a possibility within each of us, waiting for the opportunity to come to light. But it is also a reminder of what we could lose, of the humanity we can preserve if we remain vigilant. So, the next time you're faced with a situation where your morals are tested, remember, evil doesn't start with a monster. It starts with a choice, and that choice, in the end, will always be yours. Now tell me, are you completely sure that you would never fall into the Lucifer effect? Leave it to me in the comments. If this topic has made you reflect, if you have identified yourself, or simply want to explore more about human nature, I invite you to watch our video on the shadow, the dark side you don't want to see. Carl Jung. Because in the end, understanding our darkness is the first step to embracing our light. Don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already, because here we will continue exploring the deepest corners of the mind, soul, and existence. Because, as I always say, the truth is not always comfortable, but it is always worth it. Until next time, Mind Explorer.